The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, the AML automation cloud.
Money laundering is not about money, but it's about power. To all these criminal actors or corrupt actors in the world, dictators, organized crime, politicians, and companies using money laundering for their power purposes. The consequences of successful money laundering is all the bad things that we see in the world today.
Welcome to The Laundry, the podcast connecting AML, compliance, and financial crime to the real world. It's not every week that news from the Swedish court system makes headlines across the world. So when it does, you know it's big. Former Swedbank chief executive Birgitte Bonnesen is facing 15 months in prison after she was convicted of spreading misleading information about the bank's money laundering problems in Estonia. The conviction ties into one of Europe's biggest money laundering scandals, where both Swedbank and Denmark's Danske Bank were alleged to have allowed Russian oligarchs and criminals to move money through their Baltic branches and into the Western financial system. So, with an incredibly senior figure from Sweden's oldest bank now potentially facing prison time, is this crisis averted? I'm your host, Marit, CEO of Strise, and in this episode we are discussing how a jailed CEO has rocked Sweden's banking sector. We'll be discussing how this story was uncovered by journalists in Sweden, the impact of Birgitte Bonnesen's sentencing, and whether this is the end of the scandal. To dive into this topic, I'm very lucky to be joined by Axel Humlesjö, reporter at SVT, the BBC of Sweden, and author of The Honey Trap. Axel stepped out of the busy SVT production offices into the streets of central Stockholm to speak to us. Welcome to The Laundry, Axel.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
Really great to have you on. Why don't we start with you just telling our listeners a little bit about you, your background, and your book, The Honey Trap.
Yeah, so I am a journalist living in Stockholm, working for the Swedish television and the program Mission Investigate, which is a investigative documentary program that airs every week, 1 hour, prime time in Sweden. I've been working with this investigative documentary type of stuff for 15 years. And the last maybe 10 years, I've been focusing on cross-border reporting on corruption, money laundering, and that kind of dirty stuff.
And that's what we're here to discuss today. So while we are definitely going to discuss the jail sentencing, we need to take a step back. And if any one of our listeners haven't really gotten the backstory, let's just start by giving an overview of about how all this came to be. So take us back to the beginning. How did this story about Swedbank, about the money laundering, how did that come to your attention?
I think since this is a Russian story, I think I should do like Mr. Putin and start 1,000 years ago, with the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. Almost, you can go back to, you can choose different times in history to make the starting point of this saga. But I think the most natural start is in the beginning of the 2000s. There was a great hope that Scandinavian banks would save the Baltic people and the Baltic market and kind of bless them with a Scandinavian banking model that would end their tragic fate of the Soviet Union. Swedbank became the biggest bank of the Baltics. And they also opened offices in Moscow and in Ukraine. And this was a great strategy from the Swedish giant. For many years, there was a few bumps in the roads. There was the financial crisis 2008, but for many years, this was a huge success story. And it all kind of ended in 2019, 5 years ago, when we revealed as the Mission Investigate program that billions of dollars, euros had been funneled through the Swedbank Baltic branch from Russia and into different tax havens, huge amounts of suspected money laundering, and also connecting to your starting point with jail time for the CEO, we could also show that the CEO had lied about this to increase the stock value. So that was the start of what has been called the biggest trial of financial crime in the history of Sweden.
Wow. I mean, it's such a big story to unveil. What was it like for you and your team that day when this came out into the public?
The big memory that I have is not exactly when we released, but it was actually a couple of months before when we were sitting on the material of showing all these transactions, especially connected to Russian oligarchs. And Danske Bank, a competitor in the Baltics, the biggest bank in Denmark, they were involved in and had been exposed for suspicious money laundering. And the CEO of Swedbank, Birgitte Bonnesen, she wanted to show that Swedbank didn't have anything to do with this. And she jumped out in the media saying that Swedbank was totally clean. And that was, of course, because she wanted to distance herself and her bank from the Danske Bank scandal. And at that moment, we were sitting on this toxic material, and we couldn't believe that she took that such a risk of, denying their involvement when we knew that they were not only involved, but they were even more involved than Danske Bank in this dirty business.
And at this point, you knew that she knew as well. So she must have known that she would be exposed and Swedbank be exposed too. Or had you guys reached out to them at this point with the evidence and so forth? Or what do you think made her take that public stance when it was obviously not the case and she knew it wasn't true either?
I think she definitely didn't know that we were on this. Like, none of our colleagues knew. This was, of course, very explosive information for the market. If the stock value of Danske Bank had been plummeting, and even gossip about other banks being involved in the scandal was really bad for the stock. So this was super, super secret, and we were sitting on these millions and millions of lines of transactions, analyzing all of them, connecting them to a bigger picture of tax havens and offshore accounts. And they didn't have a clue. And I think this is really interesting to understand that the culture of the banks has always been that the bank secrecy will save them. Even though there's been bank scandals in the history of the world, they always believe this very tightly, that the bank secrecy will give them control. The different thing this time was that a year earlier or 2 years earlier, the Panama Papers had been revealed. So we as journalists had started to get an advantage in front of the banks, connecting the dots between all these offshore accounts and seeing how is this dirty money world connected. That really revolutionized the whole power balance between the banks and the journalists, or the banks and the media. And she never thought that she was going to be caught. She was, I believe, totally sure that this would never see the light of day, and that she would get away with this, and that she would be hugely successful, as she were at that time, of one of the best banks in Northern Europe. So we were shocked that she took this risk. And sometimes we didn't even believe. We were like, is there something wrong with our material? What is it that we don't get? Because how can she dare to do this? But I think in the aftermath, I have understood how these financial people really think, and they thought that they were totally safe.
Did you get a chance to speak to her directly at some point in the aftermath of this news breaking?
Yes. So the last time we talked to her was that finally we got an interview after our third hour that we did, and at that time she only had, I think, 7 days left of her life as a CEO. 7 days after our interview, and we aired the program, and she got fired.
Oh, wow. And was there anything that stuck with you during that interview that is relevant in 2024 towards an audience of professional financial crime fighters?
I think this goes back to the sentence that was revealed this week from the higher court of Sweden, that she was actually sentenced to jail. And I've been very amazed of the reaction of the Swedish elite in this sense, because the reaction that we have got is that, like, how is this possible? It's unimaginable that you would send this CEO of one of the biggest banks in Sweden to jail for trying to, hide something from the media. It's incomprehensible for them. And I think that is, a key for understanding the financial world and to catch people in the financial world is that they believe that they are ahead of everybody else. And they believe in some way that they are part of this kind of parallel society where they can do pretty much what they want. And this is a culture that has been built under decades with too big to fail, states saving the banks, rich people getting, paid out of investigations or whatever. And I think there is a big feeling of this doesn't really happen. And when I talk to colleagues, for example, at Financial Times, they say that this is the first time in the history of banking and financial where this has actually happened, where a journalistic investigation have put a CEO of one of the biggest bank of a country in jail.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break and then we'll be back to discuss what the jail sentence means going forward. Don't go anywhere.
Live on stage in London!
The Launder Live is back in London. On Wednesday, the 30th of October, we're gathering AML megaminds from across the industry for a night of networking and insights at the world-renowned Ministry of Sound venue. We'll be bringing you a killer keynote, a live podcast recording, a DJ set, light shows, refreshments, and more. It's going to be the biggest event for AML and compliance professionals this year, so don't miss it. Tickets are available now for free. No dynamic pricing here. Follow the link in the show notes and pick up yours now. Okay, we've looked at the backstory and let's look at the aftermath, because the former CEO, Birgitte Bonnesen, has now been sentenced to 15 months in prison. She was convicted of gross swindling by the Svea Court of Appeal, and this makes her the highest-ranking Swedish banker to go to jail over the scandal. Do you think that this sentencing sets a new precedent for holding senior leadership accountable for AML breaches? Do you think CEOs, current leadership in the Swedish banks, the Norwegian, all across the Nordics now have a higher degree of responsibility or fear that this will happen to them too? Or what do you think the change, or if any, has happened with this sentencing?
I don't know. It's a lot of speculation going on. There has been some of the richest venture capitalists going out and say that CEOs need to be paid much more now because they're taking a bigger risk, which is funny because, you can also just take the money that you have and not lie for the public. That could be a pretty good alternative as well. But there is a lot of speculation that this would lead to much less transparency, much more controlled messaging from the companies, because they would be afraid that this would happen to them. I don't think so, because this was such a specific case where there was a specific situation where the CEO really wanted to save Swedbank from being dragged into the Danske Bank scandal. And that's why she lied, and she lied on very specific terms. But I think the big consequence of it is to show that, the financial world is not part of a novelty that will, can do whatever they want and get away with it. They are part of society. They have huge responsibility. They are one of our most important institutions as a pillar of democracy and market economy. And they will be held accountable for what they do. And I think that is a very powerful message to the whole community of these bankers, that they are not... I think sometimes they feel that they're on top of the world, that nobody can reach them. They live in another society with the money that they have and the power that they have. And I think this is a great connection for them, a wake-up call of being, you're part of this society and you have to behave.
Where do you think Swedbank will go from here? I mean, this case in itself, since the sentencing come now, the case is a little bit, back in time, but do you think they'll be able to put this controversy behind them, or have they already, and where will they go from here?
This saga has been going on now for 5 years, and Swedbank has changed amazingly after it. They kicked out a CEO, they changed the board of directors, the former prime minister of Sweden went in as director of the board. They invested heavily in against financial crime. And I think that they have really changed and are now, I would say, the leading actor of anti-money laundering in Sweden due to this process. Even though it's not done yet, the biggest fine is still awaiting for the American authorities. Danske Bank got, $2 billion US dollars, and Swedbank is expected to get more. But they have already changed and learned from this. And I think now they are a very good force against money laundering in Sweden and in the Baltics. So for them, it is a question of keep on working and hoping that the punishment from the US authorities won't be too heavy.
What do you think would be a suitable punishment from the US authorities?
I don't know. The thing that really is in the negative side for Swedbank is that we were able to show that they did not only mislead the market, they did not only lie to the public, but they also lied to American authorities. And they withheld crucial information about the oligarch accounts that they had in the Baltics. And they even wrote emails with a famous emoji, a happy-faced guy in an email about not including the Russian oligarchs in the communication with the American authorities. And I think if you do something like that, you really are in a shitty place, because to mislead American authorities is probably one of the worst things you can do as a bank when it comes to sentencing and fines. So they're in bad shape.
And especially if it's then misleading them by excluding information you have on Russian oligarchs. That's a big one. Just out of curiosity, you sat on a lot of material transactions, all of these things, and now you're mentioning oligarch accounts. What was like the most shocking piece of evidence that you found, like in terms of one wire or how much money one oligarch had? I mean, what was the thing that shocked you the most?
I think for the situation today with the war in Ukraine, the one thing that really was super revealing for me was when we followed the money trail in Swedbank, we found the story about Viktor Yanukovych, the former president of Ukraine, highly corrupted, the money trail leading to Paul Manafort and the Trump election, and therefore to the situation that we have in today with Ukraine and the war in Ukraine. And I think to understand that a Swedish bank was part of this spider web of dirty money flowing from Ukraine to the US, and that this highly influential political players were part of the Swedbank story, that really, lived up to the idea of, follow the money and you can end up anywhere.
The blurb for your book also concludes, the shocking realization is that Swedbank, the most Swedish of all banks, was exploited by the FSB as part of Vladimir Putin's warfare against the West. And that example you just mentioned, is this exploitation of Swedish institutions by the Russian government, is it over?
In this case, it was very good in time that Swedbank was this actor in the Baltics, because these Russian oligarchs got kind of a quality stamp over their money, saying that this is a Swedish bank have approved these transactions. This must be white and clean. Now, we have a totally different situation in Europe and in Sweden after the war. And we can see that the Russian activities in Sweden is increasing. The espionage is increasing, and their attempts for industrial spying is more and more revealed. So Russia as an actor is highly active in Sweden, and the Russian security service is highly active here. And we can see that they are trying to penetrate the financial system and the other Swedish institutions for political gain, military gain, industrial gain, or for other reasons.
And you talked about following the money. What kind of money are you currently following in your role as a journalist?
The most interesting story at the moment we started in the spring, called Dubai Unlocked, And it was a project with 74 international partners tracking money laundering operations from all over the world, ending up in real estate in Dubai, showing that Dubai has become this center point for dirty money now, when a lot of other paths of money laundering has been closed down. The Middle East and these oil states have become highly relevant for dirty money. And we reveal that criminals, politicians, financial criminals, all were investing heavily and hiding their wealth in Dubai. And that was, I think, a project that we will keep on working with, finding more and more going on to that direction.
And to both bring the Dubai story and this Swedbank story, they both involve money laundering, lots of important people, the banking system. Why does it matter in the real world that these stories are brought to light?
My kind of mission with the Honey Trap book, which is, it's a spy story and a kind of financial true crime thriller, but it's trying to summarize what we've been doing the last 10 years after Panama Papers, which is trying to show why money laundering is not about money, but it's about power. And that to all these criminal actors or corrupt actors in the world, dictators, organized crime, politicians, and companies using money laundering for their power purposes, and the consequences of successful money laundering is all the bad things that we see in the world today, of the invasion of Ukraine, the organized transnational crime, corruption, these kind of covert security operations from intelligence services against elections, etc. Money laundering is central to this very anti-democratic activity. And I think that that's our mission, to show the connection between the people dying, people suffering, societies getting weaker and vulnerable because money laundering is such an effective tool geopolitically and for power struggles.
I could not agree more with you, and that also resonates and aligns a lot with what we're trying also to do in this podcast and with Strise. Is just with this podcast, we're really trying to connect it to the real world, show that implementation of compliance, KYC, AML, all these using AI to do that more efficiently actually can have a very positive impact on society and people's lives directly. And also, I don't believe in this like victimless crime terminology that people often use against financial crime, because it's everyone in society that will hurt if we're not able to stop this. That's why we do what we do, and just in a different way than you guys, in a sense. We're coming to the end of the episode. We are going to dish out some quick fire questions for you. So I'll say a sentence, you say the first thing that comes to mind. So are you ready?
Yeah.
Finish the sentence. This story would never have been uncovered unless...
Some very, very brave people inside Swedbank that started to raise their voices against what they saw on the bank's accounts.
How would you score the Swedish public's trust in the banking system in 2024?
The banks are not very popular, but sadly maybe it's not because of money laundering, it's because they are increasing the rates for people's mortgages, and that makes them unpopular. But the money laundering stories have been hugely damaging to the idea of the bank as kind of, this responsible actor in society.
Do you think Russia is still trying to funnel their money through Sweden's institutions?
It's much harder for them to funnel money to Swedish connecting actors, but they are very active in different kind of covert operations for influence operations in Sweden.
And finally, do you think this is the most important story you will ever work on?
It is definitely the one with the most money involved. People talk now about the Swedbank money laundering story in relation about $300 billion. So it could be the biggest money laundering scandal in the history of the world. So in that sense, I will never be close, I think, of anything in the same value, but I'm still pretty young, so there may be another bank.
300 billion is such a shocking number. That brings this spin of the laundry to an end. Axel, thank you so much for joining me. Where can people find and connect with you?
I'm happy to get connected with either on Instagram or Facebook or X or LinkedIn. We are always open for corporations or answering questions or getting good inside tips from the financial sector. So if your boss doesn't listen to you, get in touch.
Money makes the world go round.
With that good tip, thanks to everyone who is listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, check out the back catalog and follow The Laundry on your podcast platform of choice. We'd also love for you to share the podcast on your social media channels, tell your colleagues about it, drop an episode in a group chat. It really helps people to find us. Got a story you think we should be talking about? You can comment on the Strise LinkedIn page, my LinkedIn page, or email laundry@strise.ai. Your host for this episode was me, Marit. Our producer was Matthew. Our engineers were Dominic and Nicholas. The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, the AML automation cloud. Visit strise.ai for more information. See you next time.
Money makes the world go round. It makes the world go round.
You know, if you follow the money in the... now there's a lot of kids here. Should I move further off where there's less kids?
The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, the AML automation cloud.